Hello, everybody. Corrine Smith here again with another exciting edition of Studying Thoreau. It's the 6th episode in this series where I talk about resources that you can use to study the life and writings of Henry David Thoreau. Got some new equipment here that I'm trying out for the first time. Yay. Anyway, today's topic, letters and correspondence. We've already gone through most of Henry's major writings, and we covered his journal in the last 2 episodes. Now we can get a step farther and see what's available in terms of letters that he wrote, letters that he received. We actually have more to talk about here than you might imagine. As I said, my name's Corrine Smith. I worked as a librarian for a long time. In the last 20 years specifically, I've done a lot of research on our friend Henry Thoreau. I've written a couple of books about him. I currently serve as the supervisor of the Thoreau Society shop at Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. This is my own series, and this is my own perspective of this series. It's a complex one, and I am going to gloss over some details. If I do too much of that, please correct me in the comments below or send me an email. It's not my intention to skew details and to put a spin on the history, but it is my own perspective of an understanding of what happened in the last century and a half. Every book that I mention on here is on a bibliography of travelswiththoreau.com. And there you will find links to buy them. Most of these are used, except for the ones at the end, but most of these are used. And so there'll be links to used book dealer sites, and also to the shop at Walden Pond if it's a newer book, and also to bookshop.org, which benefits independent booksellers like us. So in the last 2 episodes, we covered Thoreau's journal and the fact that there's no way to get a complete one to put in your hands, and where you could get as complete a one as you possibly could. Because of course, for 25 years, he wrote about what he saw and what he felt, and what he thought in that wonderful journal. Well, another outlet where people reveal more of themselves than they would in formal writings is in letters. By the way, Mr. Thoreau's with me today. Not sure I'm going to have him here all the time, but there's a good reason for him to be here, and you will hear that whole story. So let's get back to the letters. I forgot to introduce Henry. There he is. Anyway, another place where people reveal a lot of their personality is in personal letters. I mean, it's one thing to read Walden and to have Henry tell you and everyone else in the world who reads it, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately. Thank you, Henry. Or if you go later in the book, he says, I would not have anyone adopt my mode of living on any account. I desire that there may be as many different persons in the world as possible, but I would have each one be very careful to find out and pursue his own way, and not his father's or his mother's or his neighbor's instead. Great advice. I love that line. But it's another one altogether, another experience altogether, to read his personal advice to his friend Harrison Gray Otis Blake, who he often corresponded with, in which he says, if there is an experiment you would like to try, try it. Do not entertain doubts if they are not agreeable to you. Remember that you need not eat unless you are hungry. Do what nobody else can do for you. Omit to do anything else. Well, of course. And that was in a letter to Blake, August 9th, 1850. So we're actually pretty lucky that we have the letters that we do, because before she died, Henry's younger sister, Sophia Thoreau, burned a whole lot of them. How do we know this? She wrote about it in a letter to somebody else. She said, I have found it a painful task to destroy my family's letters. Many sad duties fall to the lot of the last of the race. Oh, Sophia, what we could have had. You saved Henry's manuscripts and his journal, but not the family letters. Oh well. We are truly lucky we have any of them at all. So, how are these letters important? If we had not had them, if we had not found them, what would we be missing out on? Well, this one to Blake. What is the use of a house if you haven't got a tolerable planet to put it on. He wrote that to H.G. Blake. By the way, buy it at the shop at Walden Pond. Wrote that on May 20th, 1860. Or this one, I often put this one on the door, one day a year. I am thankful for what I am and have. My thanksgiving is perpetual. Oh, how wonderful. From December 6th, 1856. Or one of my personal favorites, something that he wrote to Parker Pillsbury in the early days of the Civil War, 1861, April 10th to be exact. Blessed are they who never read a newspaper, for they shall see nature and through her, God. Marvelous, marvelous. And more importantly, we would not have the story behind this picture. Do you know the story behind this picture? Before the hour is over, you will. Okay? It was prompted by a letter. It was prompted by a letter from avid fan Calvin Green of Rochester, Michigan, asking Henry for a picture. Okay? So, who started collecting and publishing Thoreau's letters anyway? Well, at first it was a couple of friends, of course, as they were the ones who furthered his reputation to begin with. Then when they were gone, at least one obsessive fan jumped into the fray, as they often do. In the middle of the 20th century, the main Thoreau scholars got involved, and then finally, within the last decade alone, the compiling duties fell to really the perfect person to handle all of the known letters of Henry David Thoreau. Now, at the end of this segment, I'm going to show you actually four books, three sort of books, and I'm going to recommend these to you, but I wanted to show you them at the beginning, but we are going to come back to them at the end. And the first one is The Correspondence of Henry David Thoreau. Came out in 1958, compiled by Walter Harding and Carl Bodie. Still good. From 2004, and Bradley P. Dean, Letters to a Spiritual Seeker. These are 50 letters between Thoreau and his friend Harrison Gray Otis Blake. And then I'm also going to show you the Princeton editions of Correspondence, compiled by Robert N. Hudspeth. Okay, so that's what we're aiming for. But in the meantime, I thought you might want to know how we got to this point and how the amount of letters grew over the decades in the last century and a half, because this is an interesting story and it involves major characters in Thoreauvian history. And first of all, there's this saying that if you don't find the book that you want to read, maybe that's because you are the one who should write it. That comes into play here. Secondly, there's this intrinsic need to look at works of the past and to find fault with them and decide to improve upon them. This is a habit that Thoreau people tend to have, and both of those approaches apply to this intricate story. So as you know, Henry David Thoreau passed away in May of 1862. Just 3 years later, in 1865, Ralph Waldo Emerson assembled a book called Letters to Various Persons by Henry D. Thoreau, published by Ticknor and Fields, who had also, of course, published Walden and Thoreau's other posthumous writings. Here are pictures. I don't have an actual one to show you. Thought I could get one and I couldn't. But this is what it looked like with the signature Ticknor and Fields kind of style and the style of the day. Letters to Various Persons, okay? Emerson put this one together, and he gave a 4-sentence introduction about the authenticity of the letters, how he copied them, and that some private and personal references were removed. Well, yeah, this included almost all the full names of the correspondents because most of them were still alive at the time. So they're generally identified by initials only, but you can figure out who they are. I mean, he even signs the introduction RWE, like we don't know who that is, like it's a secret, but not really. Anyway, his book contained 65 letters, okay, written by Thoreau, plus 9 of his poems, I guess, just to make it a little more. For only 3 years gone, really? 65 letters seems like a pretty good number. There are 6 letters to Thoreau family members, 30 to friend H.G.O. Blake, 11 to friend Daniel Ricketson, 6 to Mrs. Lucy Brown, which is a whole nother story that we can't get into, 1 to Frank Sanborn, and 2 to author Walt Whitman. These are all people that Emerson had connections with, so it was probably easy for him to get these letters. But isn't it interesting, though, that he didn't include any letters that Thoreau wrote to him? Now, wouldn't you think if you had a good friend who you just lost, and he was one of your proteges, actually, and you were close, and he took care of your family when you were traveling, and you decided to create a book of letters representing his character, wouldn't you think that you would start with your own collection because you know you have one? One of the great mysteries of Thoreauvian studies. Also, evidently, either Emerson or Ticknor and Fields consulted Henry's sister Sophia about the contents of that book, and she didn't appreciate the fact that that Emerson just showed one side of Henry, his stoicism. She wanted some family letters printed in there too, which is how they got the 6 in there. That's not as many as she wanted, but at least she got some of them. So again, okay, fine. So that book was printed in 1865, reprinted in the 1870s. You can still find old copies out there available, but also paperback print-on-demand reprints. And I'm not really sure you want to go to that effort. Look it up on Google Books if you're curious, and you'll really see all that you need. Rest assured that the letters that Emerson picked are in subsequent books, if that's even possible, in their entirety, if that's even possible, because later Thoreau scholars realized that Emerson had edited a little bit more than he thought of. And that book also serves to show that an editor, just by initially choosing which letters to put into the book, can skew how the reading audience is going to see that person. So that's something to think about there. So that's 1865, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Letters to Various Persons, first one. Almost 30 years later, after Emerson's compilation, Frank Sanborn brought out his Familiar Letters of Henry David Thoreau. Thank you, Fitchburg Public Library. So this came out in 1894. I mentioned Frank Sanborn before when I talked about Henry's other books and also about this journal. And I said that Sophia Thoreau was protective of the journal and that she had tried to keep it away from Ellery Channing and Frank Sanborn. Well, that didn't stop Frank from wanting to publish something about Henry Thoreau, especially after Sophia died in 1876. Sanborn would eventually write a Thoreau biography and a number of other books and articles about the Transcendentalists and all the people that he had known. But in 1894, he worked with Houghton Mifflin Company to make his Familiar Letters book, the 11th volume in the Riverside edition of Thoreau's writings. I showed you during the journal episodes the 4 seasonal volumes that Blake had assembled. This was part of that series. It came out the year after, that was 1893. This one actually came out the following year as the 11th book in the series. Sanborn had not liked Emerson's Letters book, okay? Surprise, he had not liked that. And he even says in his introduction, the selection made for a small volume in 1865 was designedly done to exhibit one phase of his character, the most striking, if you will, but not the most native or attractive. And he follows this up by saying that by that choice, Henry's sister Sophia was dissatisfied with Emerson's rule of selection among the letters. This she confided to me, and this determined me, should occasion offer, to give the world someday a fuller and more familiar view of our friend. Well, conveniently, neither Sophia nor Emerson were around anymore to substantiate that story. Oh well, so Sanborn has about 130 letters in here, about twice what Emerson had published in 1865. But you know what? It's difficult to get an exact count because Sanborn puts his own running commentary, his own running narrative between the letters. And sometimes he doesn't let the letters finish naturally with the closing and the signature. And you can't tell where Thoreau's words end and Sanborn's explanations begin. It's confusing is all. You just have to keep your wits about you when you read it. He did include the ones in Emerson's book, and many of those copies are more complete than before. But he did a lot of editing and choosing too, to suit himself and to follow the style of writing at the time. And according to later researchers, he even quoted the same letters differently in different books that he wrote or compiled, really. And if those letters are now gone, then we have no way of knowing which one is right, if any of the versions are. If you hang around Thoreau studies long enough, you hear stories like that about Frank Sanborn and about his veracity. Yes, he did know the Thoreaus and the Emersons, and yes, and all the rest of them. And he was one of John Brown's Secret Six supporters. So he was in the middle of things back then, and he could write about what he had experienced and who those people were for him. But was he accurate? That's the question. That's always the question. Maybe he thought he was. You know, perspective is a big factor here. Most folks right now look at his work with some suspicion. Although there was one researcher that I knew that said that he could never prove Sanborn wrong completely wrong on anything specific. Was Sanborn just a shirt-tailed transcendentalist who wanted to prove that he knew all these people? Or is his perspective really a valid one that we should pay attention to? You can decide for yourself. Admittedly, I usually lean towards being suspicious of what he says. Okay. Nevertheless, in 1906, when Houghton Mifflin published its 20-volume set of the writings of Henry David Thoreau, remember that one? Where the first volumes are Week and Walden and all the rest, and the last 14 are the journal. Well, volume 6 is another version of Frank Sanborn's letters. Tra-la, it's a second one. And this one, courtesy of Merrick Public Library in Brookville, Mass. Thank you. So yeah, so they had the 20-volume set. They wanted to include familiar letters again. Houghton Mifflin had published that Riverside edition. So this time, they wanted to have the whole journal in there as much as they could. Remember that story from the before. And another one of familiar letters. This version is almost exactly like this, about 95% of it, except that Sanborn made a few additions. See, 12 years had passed between the two books and new information had come to light. First of all, in the meantime, Thoreau's friend Daniel Ricketson had passed away, and his kids, Anna and Walton Ricketson, had published Daniel Ricketson and His Friends, which is a letters book between he and everybody else, including Thoreau. Now, Sanborn didn't take any letters from that because he was picking and choosing, is what it is. But he did take a sculpture, a bas relief, I guess it is, that Walton Ricketson had done of Thoreau, and he asked to use it as the frontispiece for his 1906 book. So there is that, with the Roman nose, as we often hear. He also put an appendix at the end with 8 additional letters that had come to light in the last 12 years. 2 were written to Isaac Hecker, another story I can't get into right now, but 6 were written to Calvin Green in Michigan. This is a story we are going to pursue. These letters had been released by other people. We'll get to this. Hecker's had been released by E. Harlow Russell. Remember his name from the journal episodes? Hope you do, but we'll get to Calvin Green in a minute. Otherwise, like I said, this book is 95% exactly the same, with Sanborn's running commentary in between the letters. Again, you're interested? Look it up online. look it up online. It's a duplication, but at least it adds those letters from Calvin Green. So far, in the history of Thoreau's letters, we got the 1865 from Emerson, and we got 1894 and 1906 from Sanborn. Now, at the same time, as we are nearing the end of the 1800s, two men who lived far away from Concord really began to get interested in Thoreau's writings and in his life. One is a writer and reformer and vegetarian in England named Henry S. Salt. The other is a homeopathic physician in Ann Arbor, Michigan named Dr. Samuel Arthur Jones. Both men were so taken with Thoreau's writings that they wanted to gather as much information about him as possible, even though they'd never met him. Salt wanted to write a biography of Thoreau, a bold task from England at the time, especially since he'd never met the man. Jones wanted to compile a complete bibliography and to offer lectures, maybe publish a little bit, but to offer lectures in Michigan. In their quests to learn as much as possible about our friend Henry, these two men had the savvy idea of finding people in Concord who were still alive who had known Henry. This is in the late 1880s, 1890s, okay? Henry's been gone for almost 30 years, but of course there's gonna still be people in Concord who knew him. They're getting older too. But sure, there are gonna be people there. And Salt and Jones found these people and started exchanging letters with all of these folks. And they also found each other. The history here is more complex than I'm making it. I'm simplifying it for the purposes of this program. Salt, actually both men met Frank Sanborn in person. Salt never made it to Concord, but Sanborn had gone to England and he got to meet them there. Salt didn't seem to mind Sanborn so much. He was more of a gentler person. Dr. Jones was opinionated and he did not like Frank Sanborn or his work. And he even in print said that he considered Sanborn to be a sham. And in some ways he wanted to disprove what Sanborn had approached him with. And Jones didn't really like Emerson's choice of letters either, quite frankly. Anyway, these two men and a group of Thoreau's aging friends began to correspond with one another, and many of their letters are found in these two books: Remembrances of Concord and the Thoreaus, Letters of Horace Hosmer to Samuel A. Jones, and also Toward the Making of Thoreau's Modern Reputation, Selected Correspondence of S.A. Jones, A. W. Hosmer, H.S. Salt, H.G.O. Blake, and D. Ricketson. Together, there are almost 500 letters here, and that's not all there were. This is a selection. And the friends are answering questions for Salt and Jones, and they're going back and forth, and they're answering questions about Thoreau's parents. What were they like? What's Thoreau like? His early attraction to Ellen Sewell, and even an answer to that age-old question: who paid the poll tax so that Henry could be released from the county jail? It all comes from these letters and these people talking to each other. So these are not letters written by Henry or received by Henry. These are other people coming much later, exchanging information about him. But without these men, and they were all men, corresponding with one another, we may not have the details of Thoreau's life that are so familiar to us now. Anyway, theirs is a fascinating story. I highly recommend these books as a transcendental tangent to the whole correspondence history. Henry Salt, by the way, did write a biography of Thoreau. This is a paperback version, a newer paperback version. It did come out around 1890. It is a very good one for an early one. I read it a long time ago and I don't remember quite so much about it, but I know I have things underlined in it. I know that. Henry Salt, by the way, is the person who is responsible for handing a copy of Civil Disobedience to Mahatma Gandhi. So you see all the connections. It all comes around. It all makes sense when you know this, right? Dr. Jones, to his credit, found Calvin Green living not that far away from him in southeastern Michigan. And here's the story, and here's where we bring in this. In his passion to find everything about Thoreau and to set the record straight, as he said, because Emerson and Sanborn had not, he said. Dr. Jones read through Sanborn's Familiar Letters. The first one came out in 1894. And he read it 3 years after it came out in 1897. And when he got to the last 10 pages, his heart must have just pounded right out of his chest because of something that Sanborn puts in one of his commentaries. Now, in this case, it's a good thing he wrote it. Otherwise, we might not have been prompted by this. So, close to the end of the Familiar Letters book, Sanborn starts talking colloquially about Thoreau's trip to Minnesota in 1861. And he says that he was a little benefited by the journey. I kind of disprove that in a book, but let's not even go there. But he also says, Sanborn says in here, nor does it seem that he visited on the way his correspondent since January 1856, C.H. Green of Rochester, Michigan, who had never seen him in Concord. Well, Dr. Jones is reading this. And like I said, he must have been gobsmacked. Who is C.H. Green in Rochester, Michigan? How did he come to correspond with Thoreau? This is in Jones's backyard, just 60 miles away from Ann Arbor, Rochester Township, Michigan. So Jones wanted to know. And of course, the savvy researcher that he is, he tracked down Calvin Harlow Green and visited him. Calvin Green was then about 80 years old. But back in the 1850s, Calvin Green had read Walden and he had been blown away. Blown away. Who hasn't been? Immediately, Calvin Green became an ardent fan of Thoreau. Ardent fan. He started writing to Henry, asking him all kinds of questions. And one that he really wanted to do was that he wanted to meet Thoreau someday. And if not that, maybe get a picture of it. Henry famously wrote back to him, "You may rely on it that you have the best of me in my books and that I am not worth seeing personally, the stuttering, blundering clodhopper that I am." And yet, on a day in June 1856, while Thoreau was visiting his friends Blake and Brown in Worcester, he for some reason decided to fulfill Calvin Green's request, probably because the guy had sent him money to do it. He stopped into Benjamin Maxim's Daguerrean Palace on the 4th floor of the Harrington Corner building in Worcester, and he sat for 3 images to be taken, one after the other. Each one cost 50 cents. He gave one to Blake, he gave one to Brown, and then he sent the last one to Calvin Green in Michigan with the note, "While in Worcester this week, I obtained the accompanying daguerreotype, which my friends think is pretty good, though better looking than I." And so, without a letter from Calvin Green prompting that request, we may never have had this portrait at this time in Henry's life, the 3 portraits, because they're all different. And without Dr. Jones finding Calvin Green, we might not have the letters that stimulated that whole process. See, it all together. Now, the transcendental tangential question is, where are those 3 daguerreotypes? I'm so glad you asked. I'm so glad you asked. This is a standard one that you see, and it belonged to Theo Brown, and it is now in the Thoreau Society archives at the Thoreau Institute at Walden Woods. Poster available at Shop at Walden Pond, but it has been retouched. Okay, almost all the ones that you see have been retouched. This is sort of a version of what it looks like untouched. This is from, I mentioned this before, the Annotated Walden by Philip Van Doren Stern. Go back to the Walden episode if you don't remember that. And so he has, you see we call this the carnation one because it looks as though he has a carnation in his pocket, but it's really a mark on the image. Okay. Also notice that his hair on this side, okay, looks like a V. Looks like a V over here. Okay. I mean, I think it does. You can see that on that one too. I think it does. Now, through the magic of sharing screen, let's see what the other two look like. Okay. This one is the one that belonged to H.G.O. Blake. It is now in the Berg collection of the New York Public Library in there, and this is their digital collections page. And shout out to New York Public Library. I don't think I'm violating copyright by showing their page. I don't think I'm violating their standards by, I mean, if you wanted to publish this, you'd have to, in another format, you'd have to ask their permission. So this is what, and these things were little. Look at this, it's like 3 inches by 3 inches. And you might be able to see, it looks very much like the one behind me with his hair kind of in a V and poofy hair on the top. But the marks on that image are different. I don't know if you can see too, underneath him in the gold is inscribed BD Maxim. We'll see a better version of that in a minute. It's pretty cool. This is the way the daguerreotypes were published and given. So let's go. So the one behind me is the one that he gave to Brown. The one that he gave to Blake is this one at the New York Public Library. The one that he gave to Calvin Green is slightly different. This is at the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian Institute. And this is from their website. And again, I'm hoping I don't violate anything by just showing you their website. You can see BD Maxim again in the gold underneath Henry, but his demeanor is different in this one. And you can tell he doesn't have the two tufts of hair in the same place. Now on that side of his head, there's a little one up and there's a mass under it. Also on the previous two, this one and the one and Blake's and Brown's, he had a little stray hair that was there. This one, his hair is pushed back. Was this the first one or was this the third one taken? Oh, we don't know. But that's what the three look like. That's what the three look like. Isn't that cool? And the Calvin Green one, like I said, it's at the National Portrait Gallery. The Calvin Green one is the one that was used on Laura Dossel's biography, Henry David Thoreau, A Life. Look at that. See? See? You can see his hair is complete and not that strand of hair. And he has a more casual look. His eyes are clearer, I think. His eyes are lighter. Chicago Review Press, my publisher of Henry David Thoreau for Kids, also chose that one for the cover. You can just tell the difference. You can just tell the difference in the pictures. So those are where the three daguerreotypes are that Henry got for all because of Calvin Green. Thank you, Mr. Green. But let's go back to Dr. Jones. He got Thoreau's letters from Calvin Green, along with some correspondence from Sophia Thoreau, too. And in 1898, he published his own book. There you go, Frank Sanborn. He published his own book called Some Unpublished Letters of, and here we go, Some Unpublished Letters of Henry D. and Sophia E. Thoreau, a chapter in the history of a stillborn book. An aside, yes, this is a photocopy because sometimes, friends, it is easier to get an old book by going to an academic library with a couple of rolls of quarters or a full copy card and standing by the copier for a while than tracking down a used book dealer. That's my reason for that. So this is Dr. Jones' letters book. It came out in 1898, and he includes the Calvin Green letters in there, and these letters from Sophia, and a bunch of Calvin Green's travel notes at the end, because Calvin Green made 2 trips to Concord, and so did Dr. Jones, actually. Anyway, this is how Sanborn found those 2 letters, those 6 letters, and that's how Sanborn got to put the Calvin Green letters into the 1906 book. Dr. Jones might not have appreciated that, but that's how we got the appendix in here, because Sanborn found out about the letters through Dr. Jones. Yay! It's a tangled web, isn't it? It just is. 1906, Sanborn's second one that includes the Calvin Green letters. And then, you know, we go back further and further into the 20th century. Thoreau's fame begins to grow, his reputation begins to grow. A couple of letters are found and printed privately on occasion as they are discovered. And then in the 1940s, 1950s, a bunch of scholars start getting involved and talking to each other and sharing information, and they too want to get everything about Thoreau. And fortunately, they want to share it with the public, which is terrific, wonderful. So in 1858, Thoreau scholars Walter Harding and Carl Bodie published the Correspondence of Henry David Thoreau. Let me show you there you go. The Correspondence of Henry David Thoreau. And I think this is the Thoreau Society one. This is the one that Brown had. That's a version of it, you know, obviously cropped with the background out. I borrowed this book from Richard Smith, friend, co-worker, and historian, because my copy is once again paper. It took me 2 days at an academic library with rolls of quarters. But look at this, sticky notes everywhere. I'm sensing a theme on Richard's book, sticky notes everywhere. That's because this is an invaluable resource. Harding and Bodie wanted, as they say in the introduction, to get every available surviving letter written by and to Thoreau. They weren't going to make judgments. They saw what Emerson and Sanborn had done, to a little extent Jones, but Jones didn't quite get it as much as the others. They didn't want to do that. They didn't want to make judgments. They didn't want to show just one side of him. So they gathered as many as they could, and there's about 500 in here, 500 letters to Thoreau or written by Thoreau. And quite frankly, I recommend getting a used copy of this. It used to have a dust jacket. You might find it that way. If you want a decent selection of correspondence for your own library, this would do it. This would do it. And Harding and Bodie describe things, but it's clear what is their description. There, it's usually in italics. They tell you who the correspondents are, what the circumstances are. They give you provenance. You know, it's all there. There's 500 letters in there. So now I know that Kenneth Cameron, who used to reprint a lot of primary sources about Thoreau, released a companion to this correspondence volume in 1964. I have not seen it. I'm assuming he found a few letters more that weren't in this volume. So that was 1958, folks. And then 50 years go by. And in 2004, Bradley P. Dean releases Letters to a Spiritual Seeker. And what he did, this is the correspondence history between Thoreau and Blake. This is a nice little sampler. There are 50 letters in here. The first one is from Blake to Henry. The other 49 are Henry's replies to Blake's letters, which we don't have the others. And they were good friends. Blake was a fan at first and then became a good friend. And eventually, Harrison Gray Otis Blake would become Thoreau's second literary heir after Sophia. We went through that before. So, 50 letters. They are often lengthy. They are often philosophical and opinionated. And Blake used to gather folks in his parlor whenever a new letter would arrive and would read them aloud and would share them with other people in this circle of wonderful people in Worcester at the time that included at the time Thomas Wentworth Higginson, all that kind of stuff. Brad gives nice introductions to each letter. He does annotations in the back. It's clear what is letter and what is not. If you want a sampler of letters, so to speak, from Thoreau, this is your option. This is your best and really only option. It's still available. It's also available in paperback, still available. And I do give it to you with a warning. As I warned you with journal excerpt volumes, once you start reading letters, you may whet your appetite for even more, and you may not want to stop. Just saying. Now, if even more is what you're after, if you want the mother lode, then your one-stop shopping stops at the 3 Princeton editions of Correspondence compiled by Professor Emeritus Robert N. Hudspeth. There will be a 3rd. Harding and Bodie were diligent gatherers for their time. They did the best they could at that, but 50 years have gone by. More than 50 years have gone by. There are even more discoveries to make, and Bob Hudspeth is the perfect person to find them, make them accessible to us. Bob, long ago, wrote a biography of Ellery Channing, Thoreau's best friend. And then he got into the correspondence game, and he did a 6-volume series of the letters of Margaret Fuller. So correspondence is his specialty, it's his forte, and we are so fortunate that he's the one that started doing this for the Princeton editions. And so these started coming out in the 2000s. We are lucky that he is on the job. He assures me that the 3rd volume is due out in 2021. When all 3 are together, there will be 650 letters by Thoreau and to Thoreau. Wow. Now, as you know, if you know me or you've watched some of these, I don't always recommend buying the Princeton editions of anything because they're pricey and they are a little bit different in the reading experience. But in this case, yes, this is what you need if you want the correspondence of Henry David Thoreau, because it's when it's done next year, it'll be complete and definitive collection of all of the letters of Henry David Thoreau until somebody finds more. And you know somebody will. You know somebody will, because there are attics and closets and archives out there and file boxes that could hold secret treasures. Interesting discoveries can be made by anybody at any time, unexpectedly, by accident, or even if you're trying to find them. Maybe you'll find some. That would be nice if I did, but maybe you'll find some. Here are some recent examples. In 2004, Brad Dean went to Widener Library at Harvard University, and he checked out a few books that Henry himself had checked out of that very same library during the 1850s. Yes, that's possible. Brad got home, opened up one of the books on the history of Quebec, and he found a folded up letter in the back dated Concord, December 27th, 1850. Turned out to be a handwritten note from Henry to the Harvard librarian, Thaddeus William Harris, telling him which books were being returned to the library and which ones he wanted in exchange. He had sent someone else to make this transaction. He obviously wanted it to be done correctly. So this is the books I'm giving back. These are the books I want instead. Someone, after it was done, just stuck the note in the book, and there it sat for 150 years. Maybe no one else had ever opened that French language history of Quebec in the meantime. 6 years before Brad found that letter, former Thoreau Society President Ron Hogue out and out bought a very similar letter from a rare book dealer. It too was to Thaddeus Harris, the Harvard librarian. It was dated 1851. And again, it was, these are the books that are being brought back. These are the books I want in exchange, making sure that the transaction that he sent another person for was going to be done correctly. The bookseller who sold that letter found it stuck into somebody's copy of the 1927 Odell Shepard hardback, The Heart of Thoreau's Journal. Previous owner had somehow gotten that letter, tipped it into the back of the book. You never know. In 2009, a friend of mine, former Thoreau Society board member Bob Clark was doing some research in his hometown of Waterbury, Connecticut, where he accidentally found 2 previously unpublished letters written in Henry's hand. Waterbury was where Thoreau made his last public lecture in December of 1860, and Bob wanted to find out more about the lecture and to see if there was any local documentation about it, anything left, any evidence left. And so he went to the Mattituck Library in Waterbury. He didn't find anything in the card catalog at first, but when he got a file box for that time period, he found lecture paperwork about that thing in December of 1860. And in that paperwork, he found 2 letters that Henry wrote, one confirming that he would be willing to come to Waterbury to lecture for a fee of $30. I'm thwarting the cat from coming over here. And the other letter was that he was confirming his topic for December 11th as autumnal tints. Boom. By accident, Bob found these letters. There they were, hardly philosophical or revealing, other than the fact that Henry was charging $30 a gig. Pretty cool. But still, 2 separate pages with Henry's handwriting sitting in this file box for 150 years. And they proved that he was a pretty diligent correspondent when it came to connecting with his lecture venues. So keep your eyes open. Look in boxes, look in books, look in file boxes, file drawers, closets, archives, whatever. You never know what you may find. And if after all of this, you still want more, because I'm warning you, you might, there are other books you can get to. Now, the Princetons are going to have all the known letters written by and to Thoreau. But there's more stuff to see. You can go back to Daniel Ricketson and his friends. That's a good one. Or you can go to the letters of A. Bronson Alcott. You thought he was verbose and conversational in real life. Look at all the letters. Look at all the letters. Now, you know, these people talk about Thoreau while he's alive and while he's gone too. I mentioned Bob Hudspeth's 6-volume Letters of Margaret Fuller. That's another one. There's also about a 10 or more volume set of the letters of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Here's Ralph and Lydian's daughter, the letters of Ellen Tucker Emerson. They run to 2 volumes. Okay, so there's even more. These people talk about the time. They talk about what's going on, and it's interesting to read what they had to say. So again, all the books that I mentioned are listed on a bibliography on my website, travelswiththoreau.com. I don't know what else to say except 2021, Volume 3. Oh, can't wait, can't wait. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Studying Thoreau. I hope my comments were helpful to you, and you know, feel free to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell if you want notifications. If you could write a comment or do a thumbs up down there. Like I said, this is my perspective of the history. I've glossed over a lot of the Salt and Jones and all their friends kind of correspondence, but that is a cool tangent to get into, as many transcendental tangents are. My next topic is going to be collections of essays of Thoreau. I mentioned some of them in the other books episode, but there's more to show. So in the meantime, thanks again for joining me. Take care, everybody, and I'll see you next time.